Okay, I'm going to put this down here. I'm a writer, so I'm going to say the exact words I want to say. I'm not really much of an improv kind of person. You might gather that from me already, I don't know. So let's get my first slide up. Here we go. I really like this font, by the way. My name's Hannah Nicklin. It says it up there. I'm a narrative designer and writer for and about video games, but my background's actually in theatre. I've got a PhD roughly about the spaces between performance and play, and if you really want to read that PhD, you can just put my name and PhD into Google and you will find it, but I'm going to tell you now, not even my mum has read my PhD. I know that because I had to tell her a year later it was dedicated to her. Like, she didn't even read the first page. Okay. I'm here to talk to you about a games collective called Klondike. So on a rainy, humid day in June 2016, I spent a couple of days hanging out with 4 of the 10 members of Klondike, a French games collective. We variously played DIY video games, baked lemon drizzle cake, cycled hire bikes around Lille while French and English football fans shouted abuse at us, and we went for a walk in an abandoned hothouse that played disorienting electronic music. We don't really know where it was coming from. I did so in a loose, ethnographic kind of attempt to paint a portrait of them as a collective, to walk and talk with them and try and investigate how they work, discuss their impact on the independent experimental game design community, and to, by extension, maybe think a little bit about the different contexts in which contemporary games are being made. So this is from their website, and I'm going to talk about what I've learned from them today, but I also want to really encourage you to go and play their games. Put Klondike French into Google and you'll find them, and you can play most of their games for free. So first, a little bit of background on Klondike. Klondike are made up of 10 people. Each of them is different with different motivations, aesthetics, and intentions, but in common they have the collective. Peers to make things with, to share things with, to talk and discuss and exchange with. What I'm saying is that there's not a house style. They have themselves in common. The collective was founded in 2013 by 3 members of the same medium-scale game studio, Delphine Fourneau, Armel Gibson, and Brice Petouin. There's my French accent for you. Originally, Brice thought that they might put on game jams or run events. Armel, he was eager to find friends in northern France, having just moved there from the west. And Delphine, she was eager to stretch her muscles away from being just an artist in the art department and start doing code. They called themselves a collective from the beginning, in part as a way of staking a public identity, but also for themselves, to give themselves a kind of space to work in, to give themselves something to live up to. They don't make Klondike games. Rather, Klondike has them as game designers and artists in common. It's a fine line, a subtle one, but one that is important to them. I've discovered this as I talk to them. Occasionally, they think maybe they should stand for something clearer, but they always return to the principle that holds them together. The only rule in Klondike is no rules. So according to the abstract for my talk, if you read it, I promised you 5 things I think are useful takeaways from their practices, but actually I'm only going to give you 4 because that's all that will fit into 10 minutes. But just imagine there are 5 because it's a better storytelling number. So if you're interested in what you might learn from alternative models of collective practices in games, the first one that I suggest is define collective. We don't have the languages sometimes in our everyday lives to talk about subtleties, grey areas. So Klondike are a games collective, but put them next to other examples like Copenhagen Games Collective, Sokpop in the Netherlands, or the Biome Collective in Dundee, and you might conclude that collective can mean any one of many different things. In fact, though, I would argue that collective is important precisely because it can mean any one of many different things. It can be a shared space and resources. It can be shared interests or objectives. It can be a kind of label, like a DIY music label, without the business and hierarchical hangups of the word company. And it can also connect to a political and artistic history of people coming together as equals to make new spaces for making new things. So become a collective. That's step 1. Then decide what that means. How you make shapes what you make. So think forwards and backwards about your making. Lesson 2, location, etc., etc. So Klondike are French. They're also specifically a northern French collective. Lille is a border town. Gibb made a game about his grandfather disappearing in the French-Algerian War. Thieu, she makes games about the struggles in her identity, half French, half German. Their location is present in their work and also in the way they talk about their work. So when I walked with Paul Clarissou through that creepy hothouse, he said to me about Klondike that there's something French like in doing weird arty experiments. He also said that there was a difference in games from France compared to the Netherlands or from Italy. He says that you can see the kind of backlog of culture that's behind it. But they also talk about working against general French culture. This is another quote. With this huge colonial cultural power clenching at its roots at the moment because it's feeling like it's losing it, which it is, but that's a good thing. At the same time, it's important to push back the overwhelming presence of America specifically, and just in general, the English-speaking world in games. And I'd like to propose that it can be finer grained than nation states too. So how is a Yorkshire game different to a London game or a Glasgow one? How you make affects what you make, and where you make should affect it too. Okay, so the next lesson is that size matters and location matters. No, size matters and rules matter. I can read my slides, it's fine. So Klondike works because they stopped at 10 people. Klondike knew it would only be sustainable for them to be a collective if they had a zero admin burden most of the time. So they needed a flat hierarchy, and they chose a rule: no rules in Klondike. That rule was important. It was the thing that held them together, and held inside it is not just no rules, but a stated resistance to orthodoxies about games and game-like art which unites their practices. So it's not just no new rules, but no old rules as well. They understood that all of these aims and the rule only worked if they were selective and limited. They're successful because they are light touch enough not to be a burden to one another, but by working together in the way that they come together, they're able to pool knowledge, resources, and success. So as the name Klondike grew, as Orchids to Dusk or Vignettes made a splash, eventually it added credibility to other games in the collective that might otherwise not had so much impact. This relieved a huge burden of experimental practice. So in indie games, there's a tendency for the lionization of a single name or star developer, and they're usually a white guy. This kind of collective practice, it makes room for more marginalized makers. It pools resources and success to advocate for new styles, games made from locations and with avant-garde intentions that an individual alone might struggle to advance. When you're trying new stuff, when you're asking a paradigm to shift just a little bit, it moves faster than more people are seen to push at it. So when Klondike get many very sweet applications emailed to them to join Klondike, they gently explain that they are a closed collective. Size matters, rules matter. By understanding this, Klondike built a sustainable and supportive structure. My advice is work out your parameters. And finally, this is the slide, which is my entire talk, by the way. In an online publication called Rhizome, or Rhizome, depending on how you might actually pronounce that word, the games writer Lara Polanski wrote, "To fully embrace and develop the experimental potential of games and the artistic potential for technology in a way that's socially beneficial, there is a need for broad material resistance to neoliberal effects on labor." This is just true. As I finished talking to the members of Klondike, they all spoke about how they were in a transitional phase. Klondike was possibly coming to an end. And it is important to know when things should stop. That's okay. But the reason that it was coming to an end is that half of them were leaving their universities, and Delphine, Gibb, and Brice's chômage was coming to an end. And I'll explain what that is in a second. The set of circumstances that had allowed them to come together was changing. And one of the main foundations on which a lot of Klondike's work was made was the French welfare state. That's healthcare provided free at the point of use, prescription drugs subsidised to up to 100%, free education, free universities, rent control, 20% subsidised housing in every city, 16 weeks maternity and 11 days paternity leave for employees, state-supported benefits for self-employed parents, and chômage, which, if you mutually in agreement leave your employer, pays you for up to 2 years 80% of your previous wage. A key thing underlying the practice of Klondike is their situation, the politics of where they live. And while video games is a globalized workforce, the conditions of that workforce are not global. My lesson is that socialism is a vital part of the fight for experimental cultural practices. So, some conclusions. Klondike formed in the context of their state and situation, supported by their welfare state, but also responding to a homogeneity in the way that we're encouraged to think about how we make games and why, driven by a Western neoliberal vision. What can we do in the face of that? Start our own collectives, with who is here, now, with the things we have in common. So we can look at collectives that already exist. We can look for ways of making stuff together that aren't even examples from tech and art, like craft, or Mumsnet, or self-governing South American anarchist communities, or Tumblr, or the people outside the school gate. Find people that you like, with lots of different skills from different backgrounds, and get to know one another. Make a space online or offline in the language and culture that you want to make in. Try and understand how big that space should be. Work out what your rules are and the consequences of having them. Figure out what your strengths are and offer them. Figure out what your weaknesses are and ask for support for them. Make stuff, share stuff, find ways to fight for what matters. And if you have a spare moment or two, end capitalism. Please. The last thing to say is that because there is no ethical living under capitalism, I have a book. It's a zine, a self-published zine, and if you want to find out more about Klondike, because I'm aware that I've just taken a bunch of their labor and turned it into my own talk, which I'm going to get paid for, this book, which you also pay me for, okay, but once you've done that, you'll get to read about how great Klondike are, and a lot of those conclusions arise more subtly and gently in this lovely journey through the Klondike, the awesome French Games Collective. Thank you very much for your time.
Wow. Okay. Thank you. Two things I feel like I need to say after that. One is the way you delivered that was very refreshing. Thank you, and made it very easy to listen to. Actually,
got a background.
It was
I couldn't
superb.
say words.
And something else that made it unique today was the sort of what you described as an ethnographic approach, but just the sort of the journalistic quality of it. You're reporting back on almost like a field trip, and that's very unusual. You don't get that at a lot of conferences. So thank you very much for giving us something totally different. Your title is a narrative designer, is that right?
Well, yeah, I work as both a writer and a narrative designer. I also do some production work and you know, but stuff around games and particularly narrative games.
Yeah, and when you say narrative designer and people say, so what's that then? What do you say next?
If they look like the kind who might say that, I tend to just tell them that I tell them something really boring. No, okay, so narrative design is very much like game design, but looking at story structure and how that works with games. So there's a really great theatre word, which is really quite, I think, well known in like German theatre and stuff, but is less well known over here, which is dramaturg. A dramaturg is someone who will work with a playwright to help make a play. Their job is not to write the words, but to do the research or to think about the structure, to have the view which is up here that might just go, okay, but if you move that scene there, suddenly it all just relaxes and it makes more sense. So I like that term, dramaturgy, as a way of thinking about narrative design, which is very much about taking that top-down view of, so how can the story be told not just in words, but through mechanics or through actions. So I'm designing a bunch of puzzles for a game at the moment, And the first question I ask is, how should the player feel? What's pushing them towards the puzzle? What do they think's on the other side of it? And that helps you think about what the puzzle should actually be in a way that will make it integral to the narrative design and make it not feel like just a block to being delivered more story.
Yeah, okay, almost like the story beneath the story.
Yeah.
What's driving that? Thank you. And the way you explain dramaturg reminds me of the ingénieur that helps the magician actually create the tricks. Really nice, thank you. I'm going to look quickly to the audience in case anybody's got a burning question.
Or knows how to destroy capitalism. You're out there. I know you are.
That was going to be my next
just
question.
Staying quiet.
So what I'm dying to say is, and to put you on the spot, because you said very deliberately at the start that you don't want to speak like this, but we've got a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
What was the fifth thing?
What was the fifth thing? I don't know. I cut it. No, I actually, like, to be honest, I think I just made rules matter and size matters one point and reduced them. So I have been thinking though about, because I was like, all right, everyone else is giving really solution-focused presentations here, and I'm just going, bam, here's a way to, let's try and shift paradigms, people. And it might not necessarily apply to all of everyone's situations. What if you work, what if you are currently running a business and you want to continue to run a business because we all need to survive, etc. What things can we do that will tackle some of the ideas or relate to some of the ideas and problems and solutions that I'm sort of talking about here? And I guess what I really want to encourage the tech and games community to do is to, very keen to reinvent and disrupt certain things, but one particular thing I'd like to know is, what is a union of a globalized workforce? I mean, I know there are global unions. I'm a member of the IWWW, whatever, I can't remember what all the words stand for, the Independent Workers of something, the world. I'm a member of that union, but it's pretty shit. Like, it's just endless emails from people saying, "Dear comrade, I'm in London. Come have a meeting," and it's just like, and I don't. Obviously, that has its place, and we should work with the people who are on the ground doing activism. But like, yeah, what does a union look like for a global workforce? How can we collectively show solidarity for people? Like, not just take advantage of the fact that it's a lot cheaper to work somewhere with a welfare state or with cheaper day-to-day costs. Like, what does it mean to show solidarity across those lines rather than just benefiting from them? Equally, I would like to propose that everyone here who hires people gives people a certain number of days off a year to be activists. There you go.
Some support for that.
One piece of support.
If there's a question from the floor, just put your hand up now, quickly before I... Yes, please.
I was hoping that I got that point across, but maybe I didn't quite. The rule didn't mean no rules. The rule meant we need to not burden ourselves with hierarchies or roles and responsibilities. And when we say no rules, we don't mean, it's about their work. So it wasn't, your work must be this. There's a house style. If you're a member of Klondike, this is what your work is like or how it deals with it. No rules meant not just you can do what you like, but also think of everything that's gone before in game design and how it works. You don't have to work like that. It doesn't have to have a fail state to be a game, which is one of those big things at the moment that people are boring about on the internet. It doesn't have to have a controller in order to be, you don't have to have control for it to be game art. Like, there's lots of interesting things that they do, which I think only happens because they started from no rules.
Cool, thank you. So to leave you with 3 clear calls to arms there, form your own collective, figure out what a globalized union looks like, and end capitalism in your spare time. A round of applause, please, for Hannah and all our speakers for the session. Thank you.